I genuinely wonder what I would have thought about these prequels if they weren't attached to the cultural juggernaut that they are. This is going to be a video about Sunrise on the Reaping, but it's not really scripted. I mostly have just a bunch of jotted down notes for thoughts and feelings because I happen to have a lot of them about this, and Sunrise on the Reaping managed to spark them in particular. I try not to be cynical when absorbing an attached work to an already well-established successful commercial franchise, but there is something about just knowing that this thing has a lot of baggage that comes with it as a commercial product before it even enters your zeitgeist and even comes into your hands that does kind of color your perception of it. Did I hate it? No. I expected to, but then I walked away and figured out that it was actually going to end up being my favorite entry in this entire series. But I was thinking about this and I was thinking about how much I would have loved it more if I got this as a standalone piece, if this was my introduction to the Hunger Games, if this was the Hunger Games. But Sunrise on the Reaping isn't an independent sci-fi, it exists in the universe of the Hunger Games as a prequel. Which on paper and in premise, I don't disagree with. Suzanne Collins can write as much as she wants in this world. She's selling it to the audience who wants to read more about these characters, sure. I'm somebody who's kind of wary of prequels if you saw my Furiosa video, but I'm not against them completely. It's just more like I'm always kind of braced. The fact that I enjoyed this so much isn't so much an exception, but it does make me think about storytelling and the concept of how prequels are executed in this series. Because what Sunrise on the Reaping has done for me, it has made me question if the Hunger Games can exist without a Hunger Games. I'm dropping a very vague soup on your plate, so let's take this in bites. The Hunger Games was a commercial success in 2015 and got to be one of the large cultural juggernauts right next to Twilight that really defined what media we were going to see for the next 10 years. It is the one that was the success story that spawned all the divergent copycats. Quite literally. Oh. The Hunger Games has a weird expectation laid into the bedwork of its format because unlike Percy Jackson, where you can expect to go with a bunch of kids onto a Greek mythology themed quest, Hunger Games themselves require the battle royale. When the Hunger Games fully kicked off into the movie and franchise deals that it did eventually get, I wouldn't say that it was controversial, but it was noted that all of the things that the Hunger Games books themselves were satirizing were something that the Hunger Games franchise as a larger whole was subject to. You could point at commercials and promotional material that looked like they would be right at home in the Capitol. You could see the commodification of the actors and the persona of Katniss Everdeen in popular culture. The Hunger Games, by its nature of becoming a movie franchise, would now partake in the gleeful spectacle of watching the games take place. You would buy a ticket because you wanted to see the fights go down. And without movie deals or franchise tie-ins, I wonder if I would have felt differently about this, but something interesting in the conversation of the Hunger Games is how people are despicable for looking to the Hunger Games for entertainment, but that is literally what you're reading. Before I go too far with this, I don't think Suzanne Collins is wrong for writing another Hunger Games. This isn't Playground. You can see in the execution of these stories that Collins is usually trying to be as minimalistic as possible, doesn't go into graphic detail. She's very careful about how she treats her 12-year-olds. I don't think any of them have ever suffered in a very particular way that would be especially gruesome, I guess. They're never aggressive or perpetrators of any kind of larger wrong. In fact, usually when somebody's taking care of them, they won't even have to confront the question of whether or not they will have to harm that kid. That's a very avoided discussion in this series. As much as she's writing a battle royale, she's never really going to indulge in the cruelty that is possible in those scenarios. She's never actually going to write battle royale. But of course, with the precedent of every Hunger Games book, including a Hunger Games, you have this kind of gamification of the story that I think is incredibly addictive and really good formatting, but also makes you kind of interact with this parallel concept of you are reading this for your entertainment, and this is the entertainment that this book is criticizing. I saw potential for a kind of gear shift with the prequels that apparently is not going to be cashed in on, that I think would have changed what the Hunger Games has to talk about in larger discussions. And now that Haymitch's Sunrise on the Reaping is basically just Haymitch going through his Hunger Games, and very nicely going through his Hunger Games, there's definitely a change in my gear shifts in my mind for what to expect from the rest of the prequels. With the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the thing I respected the most was the slight format change with the Hunger Games themselves, where a lot of the book is occupied from the game maker's perspective, from outside of the games, while Coriolanus Snow is trying to figure out different elements of the games as they are developing. Ultimately, a large portion of the book is dedicated to his relationship to the games as the capital, but also afterwards, it's the consequences of being subjected to being banished to District 12. The games are like a part of it, but it is mostly about an outsider's relationship to the victories, or somebody who is behind the scenes relationship to the games themselves. When you show me Haymitch Abernathy, the guy who is the embodiment of the concept of years of effort that amounted to nothing, this is the guy that I would have wanted his backstage pass for. Haymitch Abernathy has gone through 25 years of being the lone victor of District 12. The implications of his story alone are quite frankly incredibly interesting, because what you do know of him comes from his general presentation, but also the implication of the many years weighing on him. He is the only victor of the quarter quell that was with double the amount of contestants. You see that he barely got by on the skin of his teeth, and the thing that in Catching Fire was pretty significant for me was that his infraction was unintentional, just like Katniss's, where when he throws the axe at the force field and it bounces back and hits the girl, it's not something that you would say is actually like a major like act of resistance. You would see that and perhaps call it fairly harmless, or one of those things where somebody is able to like break the game master style, by using the words or the conditions around them against the actual game. But it's not like the worst infraction in the world. In fact, it feels fairly harmless. The fact that his family and girl were gone 2 weeks after he finished the Hunger Games, which he says in Mockingjay, so nobody could really leverage anything out of him. This is the thing where it goes like, they did that to him over basically nothing, which obviously changes in Sunrise on the Reaping. When I was first conceptualizing what Haymitch's story was going to be, I thought it was going to be one, trying to like actually work with the victors to make them win, realizing that's a lost cause, but then forming connections with the other victors, maybe falling into the rebellion a little bit, because he is ultimately Katniss and Peeta's connection to the rebellion. He's the one that arranges that. He's the one that has the connections to make that happen. And that's the more or less implied stuff that's never really expanded on, that you could expand on if you had Haymitch working from the sidelines and his story was a story about working outside of the games. Sunrise on the Reaping, however, is not a story about Haymitch's futile efforts outside of the games. It is now a story about his futile efforts inside of the games. Haymitch's relationship to TV and propaganda is very different from Katniss's, where Haymitch is censored while Katniss is exploited. Every act of rebellion and kindness and compassion that Haymitch has to show for in his Hunger Games is taken away from him. His image and his sense of who he was selling himself as to the audience is stripped from him. He's not allowed to write his own story. The Capitol will write his story for him. Which is an excellent angle, and I'm really glad that I read it, and I like this version of the Hunger Games because Haymitch is so involved with many other people. You get to see the expansion of alliances, humanizing moments for careers that we never got in earlier series. We just get like a larger sense of not only the incompetence being covered up, but the total power that this government, even as incompetent as it is able to exert upon this one poor guy. And it's all condensed into one life-defining year, just like President Snow's was. When Haymitch has that backroom meeting with President Snow, and first thing Snow goes off on is the fact that Haymitch has a cubby girlfriend, I never facepalmed harder. I know that like Lucy Gray Baird haunting the narrative is like a big thing that everyone's finding a lot of satisfaction in. But for me, reading that with President Snow, what, like another 15 years later, still just like kind of harking on that, it's like I've lost him for a decade and a half, and I feel like I missed nothing. The guy is running a country. I would hope that he would have something more interesting to say to Haymitch other than your girlfriend is like my old girlfriend and she's not going to be as cool. Okay. The same has been done for Haymitch now, where whatever that long, slow decline that I imagined happened in the original series is no longer a thing. It is this 1 year that completely broke him to the point that he doesn't even really register Katniss's story in his mind. After the passing of Lenore, you can just dismiss the next 25 years of Haymitch's life as him drinking and quoting the same Edgar Allan Poe poem to himself over and over again on loop. No developments after that moment are noteworthy to his story. Snow is forever defined by his experience in the 10th Hunger Games. Haymitch is forever defined by his experience in the 50th Hunger Games. The argument against this would be, of course, it would be the Hunger Games that would define their life. It's the most traumatizing event that they could go through. Yeah, I can probably follow that, but I also feel like it very much pinpoints one character's entire emotional journey to keep them stuck in one specific place, which, at least for these guys, I would hope would be like implied to have a much deeper breadth than that. When I think about Haymitch and I think about Snow, two people who at least were implied to have larger motivations and connections in between all of this, I do wonder if you're not missing something by simply defining their entire legacy as that one significant trauma. I also round back to the fact that this is a Hunger Games book, and you have to write the Hunger Games book with a Hunger Games, because if we were going to read the story of Snow's many years of rising up the ranks, or Haymitch's many years of being a failed mentor but getting a lot of interpersonal connections and relationships with other victors, these are things that don't really fit into that format. Drawing away from the Hunger Games themselves is drawing away from the appeal of the Hunger Games series. It's like turning on Taskmaster or Big Brother or Survivor and not expecting them to go through the challenges and do all the repetitive things that you want. You want to read the Hunger Games book because you like also the Hunger Games themselves. You like seeing the people who are reaped at the beginning. You want to see how they perform in the chariot, in the interviews, in getting alliances, in basically cultivating their own image, and how they show different elements of resistance or rebellion within the confines of this repetitive system. Just like any reality TV show, I start to wonder if the Hunger Games books are less important for simply which character they're talking about than their reaction to the Hunger Games. Because it is an addictive formula, and it's a fun formula, and it's one that everybody wants to see because the what ifs of the situation are really fun to go through. Like, Hunger Games AU is up there with Coffee Shop AU, where every fandom at least has one of those because the scenario itself is what's so enticing. And though I know the Hunger Games series can exist without the Hunger Games, I wonder if it should. Anyway, notify me when the fights break out for the casting of the new movie. I'm gonna go back into my little hovel. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I was able to manhandle this into like a really comprehensive 10-minute video, but I did have to drop some points on the way. One of them will end up being a bonus video that's attached to the Patreon version of this video, and another one was going to be about how these adaptations kind of fail Mockingjay, because Mockingjay isn't really meant to be the type of story that they wanted it to be. But we'll leave that for another time if anyone's interested. Otherwise, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.